Why do you think regionally it's important?
So important for many reasons. When we first talk about regional distribution of fat mass, we know that if people store more in their abdominal region, it is linked with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. But working in this space, and I work with, for example, a lot of bariatric or retired NFL athletes, you cannot tell by looking at someone, particularly in their belly region, if they store more on the outside or store more on the inside. And we would call that visceral fat. And that visceral fat is essentially excess fat that sits on your organs. Your organs have to work harder. And it's that visceral fat that is directly linked to metabolic syndrome and diabetes. And so there's many reasons we would want to see that. One, can we catch it before it gets too high? And then there are lifestyle changes that can help minimize it and at least minimize the gain of that. And so basically by altering that, you can impact health. When we think about muscle, it's very relevant when we think about preventative health care. So as we age, there's lots of joint injuries, knees, shoulders, ankles, even when we think about slips, trips, and falls or surgeries and muscle mass on each side, we can start to see imbalances which can correct. Or when we think about, just for example, a loss of muscle that can be targeted and is directly related to health and quality of life and functionality as someone ages. There's a lot of information in there. I don't know if there's something you want to pull out.
Well, let's talk about abdominal regional fat. So I've heard before that DEXA doesn't even really measure VAT, visceral adipose tissue, accurately. So help us understand how it measures it and how much weight we should put behind kind of what we think about.
So the gold standard of visceral fat measurement is MRI. But having done MRI, it's still an estimate. I mean, we are estimating how much is there. With DEXA algorithm is based on MRI, and so it is an estimate. And then we will also use ultrasound to measure or estimate visceral fat. And so I wouldn't put all my money in the value that it gives, but it is a really helpful estimation of kind of the scale of high, moderate, and low, and how does that value change? It goes back to, I think one of the most valuable things we can do with body composition is to measure change. A single time point isn't always the most effective. It's very effective for creating kind of specific recommendations, but the change piece is really helpful, and that from some of these methods is really helpful in that tracking of how does it change with age or with different lifestyle strategies or medication.
So if I understand correctly, it doesn't, you do care about the number you get, you do care about the VAT number you get, but it's not so much the number that matters, but the directionality of that number. Is it increasing, decreasing? Is it, I'm assuming though, the estimate, we feel comfortable enough with the estimate that if it's really high or really low, we can kind of clinically make decisions about that and say, yes, you probably do have metabolic syndrome because, or you have enough VAT that it's dangerous, or you have too little VAT, you're undernourished. Is that how you'd kind of think about it?
Definitely on the high end. And I always like to pair it, if we're trying to understand health, it is helpful to pair it with clinical outcomes. So for example, blood work. So for example, if I have someone with a moderate amount of VAT and no indications with their blood that there are, any metabolic pre-markers, that's a really important time to make lifestyle changes because that VAT is elevated. We see often, let's say, if a high amount of VAT, you can still have a high amount of VAT and not actually currently yet have some of these metabolic outcomes. but we know that is directly associated. So it's bound to happen without changes.
Hmm.
The low end's a little bit different. You can have 0 VAT and be very healthy. And we do see that, like activity and specific. So a lot of my work involves high intensity interval training. And partly why is because that's one of few ways to target visceral fat. And so it just allows us to make more prescriptive recommendations based on how much visceral fat. The other really important thing too is it starts to help have that conversation about genetics. If you're predisposed to some of these things, your visceral fat could be an initial indicator. And also visceral fat is quite high in individuals that have a lot of alcohol consumption. So again, it gives us an idea of maybe you have a very healthy lifestyle but drink a lot of alcohol, or you live a healthy lifestyle but have a predisposed genetic risk for some things, and that might show up first in your visceral fat.
I really like that idea that you can use VAT as a pre-indicator of possible disease in the future. What are kind of the cutoffs that you use to say this amount of VAT is concerning? We want to get you below this amount.
It's a great question. I mean, I think that's another reason why it's not like all or nothing, is there's not great normative data, and it depends on the specific DEXA or what method. But I would say, it's more, I can't give you an exact value. Usually, there are some norms. It's above the 50th percentile in general for both that and body fat. Body composition is where we want to have that. Let's take a closer look.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I know that even, body composition data, the NHANES data set, which is the national data set we use to understand body composition, I mean, the first ones didn't even have visceral adipose tissue. And so
so they didn't have the algorithm. The software didn't measure it. And so now they have it because it's a new estimation. But one thing to think about is if someone wears a lot of tight pants around their waist, when measuring, it will change that visceral fat estimation. And so it just shows like the way you measure and the limitations of some of this, which would then impact how you might categorize someone.
Yeah. I mean, that makes me just wonder procedurally, when somebody comes into your lab, do you make sure that their pants aren't tight?
Yes. Or we give them different pants.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
And, I think it's a really important conversation because you hear in the media like, oh, you can't target abdominal fat and you can't target visceral fat. When in reality, you can, not by doing a bunch of crunches. But that's where those changes are really helpful, of like tracking changes and understanding like what's normal for you, which is why these assessments are so important. Like what is a normal value for you can change, and it allows you to establish those goals based on you and your lifestyle.
Yeah.